All right, so well, welcome to the first session of our Seventh Row's Lockdown Film School. I'm Alex Heaney. I'm the editor-in-chief of Seventh Row, and Orla Smith is also here, our executive editor, and she'll be facilitating the discussion. And we're super excited to have two really amazing nonfiction filmmakers with us for this session. Who I will introduce you to in a minute. We'll introduce in a minute. So, I mean, if this is your first time kind of interacting with Seventh Row, we're an online publication and publishing house, and our sort of ethos is to help readers think deeply about film. So we're really, visit Seventh Row to revel in the active love of outstanding under the radar cinema. And our bread and butter is in-depth interviews and well-researched essays, which allow us to demystify the myriad technical choices behind the films we love. With Lockdown Film School, our goal was to really try to offer an experience that just wouldn't be possible in normal times. So the idea is to sort of bring together filmmakers who are, it might actually be hard to get in the same place at the same time, for an in-depth discussion. So today we're doing nonfiction filmmaking. Next week we'll be talking to two cinematographers, Ashley Connor, who did probably best known for Madeline's Madeline and The Miseducation of Cameron Post. And then we also have Canadian cinematographer Kathy Lutz, who has done Mouthpiece, Firecrackers, and most recently Disappearance at Clifton Hill. So we're excited about that. We'll be announcing a whole bunch of other future programming in the coming weeks. So as you may know, Lockdown Film School, it's like completely free. But if you want to support Seventh Row, we would super appreciate it. And if you want to do so, you can buy one of our ebooks. So we actually, every 3 months, we release an ebook that brings together thoughtful criticism about a film, filmmaker, or topic. Our most recent ebook looked at the films of Celine Sciamma. It's called Portraits of Resistance, the Cinema of Celine Sciamma, and it's actually the first book ever published that's dedicated to looking at Celine Sciamma's films in depth. So you can find out more about that at sciammabook.com. And in June, we're going to be releasing Roads to Nowhere, Kelly Reichardt's Broken American Dreams, which offers a 360-degree look at Reichardt's process. We got in-depth interviews with Reichardt herself and her team of long-term collaborators, and then sort of honing in especially on First Cow, which is her newest film. So if you're interested in that book, you can find out more at reichardtbook.com. That's reichardtbook.com. For today's session, we have two really amazing filmmakers with us. Penny Lane, who has, her most recent film was Hail Satan, and I first met Penny at Sundance a few years back to talk to her about her film Nuts, and that interview is actually in our book on documentary filmmakers, which that's what my banner is in the background, called In Their Own Words, Documentary Masters. And Carol sort of came to our attention just back in September with her short film, No Crying at the Dinner Table, which was absolutely one of our favorite films that we saw at the Toronto International Film Festival. So, Orla, I'll let you do proper introductions.
Yeah, I mean, you did a pretty good job there. I'll just read off the bios that we wrote on our landing page, which you may have seen already. But so yeah, we have Penny Lane, who is a creative nonfiction filmmaker whose work has gained prominence in recent years with work such as Nuts and Hail Satan. She has a knack for approaching outlandish subject matter like Satanic Temple in a humane and sincere manner. And we discussed her in our book on documentary cinema. And then Carol Nguyen is a young emerging Canadian filmmaker. Her latest short film, No Crying at the Dinner Table, premiered at TIFF in 2019 and recently won the prize for Best Documentary Short at the South by Southwest Film Festival. And yeah, I guess we proceed with the chat.
Sure.
Go ahead. Well, yeah, first of all, I just wanted to kind of talk to you very broadly about what draws you to
ask questions.
Pardon?
Just tell people how to ask questions.
Yes, that's a good point. So yeah, if you look below on your screen, this is also our first time using Zoom, me and Alex. So we're learning as we go along, but there is a Q&A feature. So we're going to leave like a bit of time at the end to kind of answer your audience questions. Some of you have given us questions in advance, but basically we want to give you the chance to kind of like react to what we're saying and give us questions in real time. So you can go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page and just type in your question, and we'll be kind of looking through them as we go, and then at the end we'll get to some of them, hopefully. So yeah, feel free to ask us anything you want. But yeah, so to proceed with the chat, I just wanted to ask you, first of all, very broadly about what draws you to nonfiction filmmaking as an art form, because I'd say that like for both of you, at least kind of like 50% or a majority of your work is nonfiction in some capacity. So yeah, what do you think that a particular kind of genre of film uniquely offers?
You want to go, Penny?
You go. No, you go.
I would say that I do both fiction and nonfiction, but you're right in the sense that most of my work is nonfiction. And I think what draws me to nonfiction is I feel like there's more room for me to experiment. And I feel like the stories that I'm interested in are better told in nonfiction. And a lot of the time those are family history stories or stories that have to do with capturing the real life people. And that's a really hard question, but I also find that there's always kind of a value in knowing the truth to something. And yeah, maybe Penny, you can expand more on it because you're more experienced.
Well, I like what you said about there's value to knowing the truth about something. I do think that is primarily what motivates me. I'm just genuinely curious about the world, like the world we live in. And I'm much more motivated by my desire to like accumulate and communicate knowledge than I am in my desire to like invent. I don't think of myself as being particularly like into like creating images or like inventing things. And so I love to discover things and like share them. But then the other thing is that like all art is just constraints, right? Like you choose constraints that suit you and then you like slavishly obey them for whatever reason. And I like the constraints of nonfiction. I think they're super stimulating. And a lot of what I enjoy about the kind of contortion I have to go through to kind of try to construct stories and, communicate arguments using only true things or mostly true things or whatever we probably get into that later. That process is stimulating to me. If you just gave me like a blank piece of paper and said like, here, do whatever you want, I think I would just have no idea what to do. So I like the kind of act of, like trying to work within those constraints so much that I can't even imagine making without it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you both use the words like the truth, which is like, I think that's something that if you think about like the label documentary, people see it as, fact and truth. Yet both your films really play with like personal subjectivity. And Penny, you're even kind of like explicitly playing with the audience's perceptions in your films and kind of twisting them. And I mean, Carol and No Crying at the Dinner Table, through the act of making a film, you're kind of changing the subjects in real time. So if documentary filmmaking is, I mean, do you see it as the truth? And if you don't, like, what is it that kind of makes it so interesting to you? Because I suppose it's not as black and white as that.
I definitely think that, you know, it is some part truth, but once you put a lens and a frame and make a decision on how you tell a story, it's not completely true. And I think that's the biggest part about documentary and journalism. The biggest difference to me is that there's some artistic opinion, some artistic choice that's being made around the story and your argument, whereas journalism is supposed to tell the thing as it is. And for me, I think the interesting part about that is to actually be able to shift the truth and to shift what you see in real life and realism. In my documentaries, I often stage things and fictionalize some parts. So I like to take us back in Every Grain of Rice to like the afterlife, or in No Crying at the Dinner Table, I stage scenes where I use them over top of their interviews. So to me, I find that those sort of things in nonfiction filmmaking help me open another facet of filmmaking, another realm, and to be able to build on top of the truth, the layer of truth that you can't see. So that's what I like about it.
Yeah, I feel like I'll never really have a total answer to this, because it's something that I think it's part of the process of nonfiction filmmaking, is grappling with these questions, you know. And if it were simple to say like what the truth was, we wouldn't have epistemology or philosophy, or, you know, we just wouldn't have all these like, you know, complicated traditions where we try to argue it out. And I would just say one thing is that, you know, like storytelling in and of itself is not necessarily kind of engage, like it's not a true or false proposition. Like a story is a story, right? An image is an image. An image can't be true or false. An image is just an image. Like you can make any image you want. It's not a lie to do so. So the complexity here is that I used to be, before I was more experienced, much more kind of rigid in my thinking about documentary, because I just didn't even know what I was talking about yet. You know, I mean, I was bringing a kind of like discourse of, you know, truth and falsity from the realm of language, in which it makes sense to say like a proposition that comes out of my mouth is either true or false, and imposing it onto this art form where it kind of fits and it kind of doesn't, you know. And that was what I figured out when I did the film Nuts, because, you know, the film Nuts plays with these ideas on purpose. Like the film lies to the audience on purpose and then reveals that it's done so. And I wanted to, it's kind of admit that I wanted to confess the lies in some sort of document to go alongside the film. And so I ended up creating this database of footnotes, and it started really simply. I was like, oh, I'll just go and write down all the lies, and then I'll make a list, and then I'll be clear of all the lies I told in this film. But then when I tried to do it, I realized that that didn't actually apply to the process, because then you start going crazy and you're like, every edit is a lie, like every image is a lie. You know, you start to kind of like realize that this doesn't map directly onto the process. You can have like a narrator or a person in your film say something, and then that you could evaluate as like a true or false proposition. But you can't say like two images next to each other in a sequence are somehow true or not. Like that doesn't, you know, there's things that you're implying, but you're not actually saying, you know. So anyway, so the footnotes for Nuts, I think, are super fun to look at, because you could watch me like lose my mind trying to understand like what would it even mean to talk about truth and lies in a documentary. When I started that project, like much more certain that I could, and then I realized in trying to actually do it that I couldn't. So it's a long-winded answer, but I just think that, you know, like even something as simple as saying like truth and facts aren't the same thing. You know, you start to kind of realize that we conflate a lot of these words into one thing, and they're not, you know. And then other people really think more about a word like reality. And I think actually a word like reality might have more meaning in the discourse around documentary than the word truth. It might be that what we're doing with art is representing reality in some sense, not necessarily like representing the truth, whatever that is, even though I know it's important to do so, you know. I don't know.
Yeah. I have a really interesting example. When I was in film school, in one of my editing classes, all the students received the same footage of this woman climbing a mountain. And we were told to edit it from point A to point B. And by the end of it, you saw that everyone had a different perspective of the story, a different understanding of what she was feeling. And I think that goes to show that, you know, as soon as you insert a person into a creation of something, they have their own truth to it as well. So there's no certain truth.
Yeah. Carol, are you still in film school?
I just graduated. However, I'm going to have a Zoom graduation, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
They'll give you a Zoom diploma.
Yeah, I don't know how it's going to work.
They don't really give you a real diploma at graduation anyway. It's just an empty piece of paper. They mail it to you later.
Oh, that's so sad.
Right? It was for me. I think that's pretty common.
Well, Penny, did you go to film school?
Not really. As an undergraduate, I studied I didn't really want to have a major, so I did a major called American Studies, which was sort of a multidisciplinary major where I didn't have to have a major, basically. So I took a lot of classes and different, you know, and I took some film, like sort of criticism classes, but I didn't take any filmmaking classes or any art making classes at all in all of my time as an undergraduate. And I look back at that and I think that seems strange to me now, but, you know, this is now 20 plus years ago, and I simply didn't have the self-confidence. I taught filmmaking for over 10 years at universities, and I tried to constantly remind myself that my students were brave just for being in the room. Like the notion that I would like make something creative and then share it with like a group of people at that age was impossibly intimidating to me at that point in my life. And so after undergraduate school, I started kind of working in a nonprofit at which part of what we were doing was doing like media education with children. So I was watching like little kids learn how to make videos, and that was a not intimidating environment. And so I was like, oh, I'm watching like 5-year-olds pick up video cameras and make things, and they're pretty cool. So that was kind of actually the place I started making videos. And then I did an MFA, but the MFA was in video art. So I was kind of at that point much more embedded in a kind of fine art tradition of moving image. And I was kind of a poor video artist for a while before I realized that I was much better at making documentaries.
I think both of you have quite unique sort of approaches and styles, and I'm curious, like, because I find it difficult to sort of compare you to other filmmakers. So who do you take inspiration from? Like, are there any particular filmmakers you'd cite?
Carol?
I love Hirokazu Korida. He's a Japanese filmmaker. He did Shoplifters, but I'm more inspired by his early work. Particularly, there's this film called Afterlife, and it's a beautiful documentary that really well blends nonfiction and fiction into a film. And I think there's no particular director except for him that really inspires me with their body of work, but certain films, especially experimental documentaries or fiction documentaries that have some aspect of documentary in it. There's something about the kind of blending of the lines that I'm really fascinated about, and I can't put words to why yet.
Yeah, I actually really resonate with that idea. There isn't really one or even multiple filmmakers whose entire body of work I find very important. I'm not a very good fan in that way. Like just because I like some of Werner Herzog's films doesn't mean I don't find the kind of like weird idolatry of him disgusting and off-putting. Like I think like, yeah, he made really good films, but I also don't think like I should just assume everything he makes is good, because it's not. So some of Werner Herzog's documentaries were really important to me. Like certainly some of Agnes Varda's films were very important to me. And when I was sort of early in the beginning stages of like making that shift from video art to documentary, the film Exit to the Gift Shop was very important to me. was hugely impactful on me, in part because I was so kind of, what I loved about it was, I watched it on like Netflix or something. I mean, I didn't see it like at Sundance or whatever. I saw it when it came out on home video, and all of the reviews for it were like, this is a funny documentary about street art, like, haha, or whatever. And I just felt like 99% of the people who loved it and gave it 5 stars, like, didn't even get it. And I thought that was actually really cool. And I really wanted to do that. I was like, oh, it'd be so great to like make films where a lot of people enjoy them. They're like entertaining and accessible and fun, but there's a layer to it that like maybe not everyone is going to tap into, but they will enjoy it anyway, like, popcorn movie style. But then you give also something to people who want to like watch a movie 10 times and really dig into the intricacies of it. So like that was really inspiring with Nuts. That was kind of exactly what I wanted to do with Nuts until I saw Exit. I hadn't ever really seen a movie that I thought did that, like made a popcorn movie that also had the potential for like that really bizarre kind of film nerd engagement. But then I would also just say that I'm much more excited by, I don't know, like someone's first documentary that's kind of off in some way and like a little weird, and maybe not even always very successful, but kind of like swung for the, I'm trying to use a sports metaphor, which is a good idea. I don't remember what the metaphor is I'm looking for, but swung for the bleachers, is that the phrase? I'm much more excited by that than I am by like mastery. Like I don't really care about mastery. It doesn't inspire me. It kind of turns me off. And what I really like is to see someone kind of trying to work it out in some very cool, exciting way. So I love going to film festivals because that's where I often see like a whole range of just like, wow, like what a weird way to make a movie. Like, maybe that's a way you'd make a movie if you didn't really know how to make a movie yet. And that's actually more interesting than people who do know what they're doing.
Yeah. We've been using the label like nonfiction and creative nonfiction when obviously people are kind of more familiar with the documentary label. And that's actually based on something that you told us in an interview, Penny, that, you much more resonate with that label. So I just want to kind of discuss what you both feel about like the documentary label, because it is like a lot of both of your films are quite difficult to classify.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing about it, which is that I think one of the reasons that I like the term creative nonfiction so much is that I've always been a huge reader. And long before I ever had any interest in film or making films, I was enamored of writers. And I still wish I was a writer in some sense, but I don't have the rigorous like discipline for it. So creative nonfiction as a sort of thing I already understood from the world of my reading was something that I was very excited by. And I still to this day find myself much more like engaged in some sense with the concerns of some of the writers in the world of creative nonfiction and how they're thinking about their craft and their form and what they're trying to accomplish than I do with the typical documentary filmmaker. So it's not that I'm a writer. It's just that I like that it puts me in conversation with people that I really truly admire and like kind of love a lot.
Well worded. I think for me, I haven't been able to classify myself in terms of like what exactly I do if it's not documentary, but I mostly use just the word documentary or documentarian because it's just easier to understand, especially for people who don't do films.
Yeah, and I think it's a useful term. Like you're kind of like, I think of it as like a certain type of claim. Like you're making a certain kind of claim about the type of constraints that you put on yourself by calling your film a documentary. And so there's ways that you can break that trust. Like you can, sort of mess with the promise of what a documentary is in a very interesting artistic way. But the fact is that you're making some kind of sort of pacts with the audience about like the type of creative license you either are or aren't taking. And I think it's a useful way to communicate with people. Like, so if you refuse to do it, that's why I don't think hybrid is a particularly interesting, like, I don't know why that keeps coming back. Like, it actually doesn't communicate anything to an audience to call your film a hybrid film. Like, it's okay, I guess, if that's what you want, but what are you actually trying to tell the audience with that term? I always find it so weird. I never know how to like I don't know how to enter a film that calls itself a hybrid film. Pick a team.
It's like there seems to be this kind of false idea that that if you've got sort of talking heads that are being interviewed in front of a camera, that what you're seeing is absolute truth, or even if you're seeing sort of like a fly on the wall documentary, that you're watching something happen as it happened, as opposed to condensed and maybe rearranged. And I mean, this is something you were saying, Penny, about how, like, is a cut false or is a cut a lie? And it seems like a lot of, like, all documentaries are engaging with that to some degree, but I think one of the differences with both what you do, Penny, and also what you do, Carol, is you guys are sort of more upfront about it. Like, it's like the fact that you are engaging, like the fact that you are making choices and that you yourself are the storyteller is kind of like explicit or text, especially with Nuts, where you're like, oh, by the way, we lied.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's actually a really early stage in history for this entire form. Like, film in general is not that old, but anything that you might call like this kind of whole discourse around a documentary and what a documentary is, we're just like in an infancy period. And so, the extent to which we have useful language for what it is we're doing, I think we're early in that process. And I think over time, again, I think about writing. Writing's had a few more thousand years to kind of work out sort of different ways that we approach, a memoir versus, a journal, a work of journalism versus, a kind of essay form or whatever. And so I just think we don't have like very sophisticated language yet to really communicate what we're doing. But I do think that most audiences have a sense of like the kind of truth claims a certain form of film is making. Like, so if you have like a film like Nuts, the very first shot in the movie is like a cartoon of goats having sex. Like, what is it that I'm signaling about like my documentary here? You know what I mean? Like, or if you have a film with performative elements or elements that are obviously kind of restaged in some sense, like you're communicating something to the audience, even if you don't say it or make a big deal out of it about what it is. And people do have the ability to tell the difference between a Katie Couric TV special and a Michael Moore film. Like, they just can. Like, you can tell. Like, there's a lot going on in the communication of what, so putting all those things together into one category of documentary, arguably, it's okay, but it doesn't always communicate like everything that maybe you want to be able to communicate about what tradition you're working in a sense.
I'm curious because, like, with both of you, and especially with Penny, what you were talking about to do with like you're playing with audience perception, in a sense, the way you're editing the film, and do you pre-screen your movies much for your audience and like kind of consider their feedback during the edit, because the audience perception is like such a crucial thing about your films?
Yeah, I love screening it. I love rough cut screenings. Like, I kind of can't get enough of it. And one of the problems that I've been having kind of more lately in my career is that sometimes the funders that I'm working with have their own set of rules about like who can see, like how many people I can show the movie to before it's done. And I'm like chafing against that because I'm like, no, I need to show it to like a lot of people. But it's not as bad as, I have friends who have worked on like heavy, like sort of celebrity documentaries or whatever. And like their constraints are even worse. It's like they can't have any rough cut screenings because it's like a big secret that they're making the movie in the first place. Like, this is like a real thing. I know. And so they feel like totally creatively, screwed because they like either have to like break this terrifying contract with these like very powerful people to be able to get notes on their cut, or they can't show it to anyone at all. And I find that that's like my nightmare. Like I'm like terrified of that proposition because I think the audience, you have to be good at doing it, obviously. Like, again, I was a film professor for a long time. So I see students struggle with like how to take notes. It's like, obviously you need to have some sort of, call it whatever you want, but like backbone of certainty about what you're doing that you can't break But, but then you also have to be like willing to hear things that are actually worth hearing, and almost no feedback is worth hearing. And so you have to be able to tell the difference between feedback that's worth hearing and feedback that's not. And people will usually people giving feedback they'll think they have a solution to a problem, and they usually don't know what the solutions are, but they're helpful at identifying problems. So like maybe the person is bored in the second act and they don't know why, and they're like, you should just cut this whole scene, or like this whole character could go, or whatever. And like they don't necessarily know what they're talking about, but when they say they're bored in the second act, that's something that you should be paying attention to and trying to solve in your own way. So I find that usually people's suggestions that are specific about how to fix your movie are usually wrong, but they're sharing that they're bored or confused or excited or whatever is never wrong. That's always useful.
Yeah. I think learning how to identify constructive criticism and then learning how to take it is such a powerful tool to have in your toolkit, not only for artists, but in life. And it's something that you have to learn, and you have to get the experience to be able to build and to actively use that muscle. For me, I also show my work to others outside of the edit room as well. And something that I've also learned throughout the years, especially in film school, is showing your work to everyone is not the best idea. You have to carefully select who you show it to, because of course, all feedback is useful, but during that process in editing, especially where you're at a stage where you're so vulnerable and you're so attached, there's also a part of you as the filmmaker that you have to salvage.
Right.
And it's very important to keep sometimes the first stages of the film within a close circle. And that's something that I've learned. And then, once it advances, for me, I decide to reach out further outside of that circle.
I think that's very, very wise. And I would just add one thing to it. Like, not only should you be protecting that like very delicate sort of seed of a creative idea that might be fragile in the early days, but also like most people don't know how to watch a rough cut. Like, especially people that have no experience with film and they've never made one and they haven't made many. They don't know how to see a rough cut with like the sound mix is all bad, and they don't know why they don't like your movie. They don't understand that the sound isn't done yet, and that's actually affecting their experience in some way, or the color, or that it's rough, that every scene is like twice as long as it should be because that's the normal stage of the edit that you're in. And so it's kind of like exactly that, like you widen the sphere as you go out. Like you can't show like for feedback to like normal people who aren't film people, a cut until it's pretty far along, like until it like kind of resembles a finished movie, even if it's not done. You can't expect a layperson to give you helpful feedback on that. I learned that the hard way many times, because you just think, well, this is my friend and they're so smart and they know it, and it's like, no, they still don't know what they're talking about, and now they think you're a terrible filmmaker on top of like you didn't get any useful notes. So that's definitely something you have to learn over time too.
I'm curious, I'm sure you get this question a lot about like how much you choose to include yourself in your films. Is that something that you decide on before you even start the process, or is it something that kind of like comes about naturally?
Well, Carol, what do you think?
Well, my work often consists of me behind the camera asking questions or voiceover. If I'm ever on camera, it's by accident, or the camera just happens to be on while I'm stepping in frame. But for me, I just prefer not to be on camera, just because I don't like being on camera, quite frankly. So that's just my personal opinion.
It's a perfectly normal personal opinion to have as a filmmaker. I would like never let someone make a documentary about me. I think about that all the time. Like when people like agree to be a subject of yours, like it's such an amazing honor and such a huge amount of responsibility. And I think about that every time, because again, I would never say yes to this. I would definitely agree to do like an on-camera interview or something in a very controlled situation. but letting someone just into my life to like tell my story seems so insane. But yeah, no, I always think of myself as like, yeah, I mean, I'm playing the kind of surrogate for the audience. I'm always trying to like sit in their position and imagine like how they're being pulled through a story. And so to the extent that I think my act, like my voice or my face or my own story in some way is useful to the audience, then I'm all for it. And that's varied wildly over my, 15 whatever years of making films. Like there have been films I've made that are about me and about my experience doing something as a way of getting into something else. And there are films where I've been kind of reluctantly brought into the process because I've realized that for whatever reason, I kind of need to be part of this to help communicate what I'm trying to do. And I'm working on a film now that's kind of like that, and it's such a drag because I don't want it. Honestly, the last thing I want is to be in my films, but this thing I'm making now, it seems like I have absolutely no choice. And so yeah, not fun.
Yeah, I'm also in my next film, but as an animated character. So.
Oh, good. That's a good. That's a good workaround.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask about the animation actually, because both of you have used animation mixed with kind of documentary elements. So how do you decide that that's an approach you're going to take, and what do you think that lends to the process?
For me, I've been making films since I was in high school. So since then, if I had ever chosen animation, it was just experimenting. But my next film is about my experience going to Vietnam for the first time. So I'm Vietnamese, and for all of my life until October of last year, I'd never been to Vietnam. And so my identity of what it means to be Vietnamese has been constructed around, what my family has told me about Vietnam. And the experience was very jarring. I thought about my realizations, the present time of what it actually meant to be in Vietnamese, this identity crisis. I thought of my parents' dreams and their past and my future, my relationship with Vietnam. And I remember I took a camera and a microphone to Vietnam, and I had planned to make a film because I knew it would be a very eye-opening experience for me. And during my last month there, I was just like, I don't know how to make this in live action. I don't know how to talk about dreams, the past, the future, the present, whatever, in live action. And then it hit me. I was like, holy crap, this is a animation. This is a digital animation. And I was like, holy crap, I've never done this before. And animation is expensive. So that's.
Do you do your own animation, or are you talking about like working with animators?
No, I am directing the animation, and we'll be working with a lead animator.
Cool.
Is that a short or a feature?
A short.
And Penny, thoughts on animation?
I'm just thinking about Carol's project. Sorry. I'm like, I want to talk more about this, but like, because I think it's interesting, like, when Joshua Oppenheimer made the Act of Killing, one of the things he described that film as was a documentary of the imagination. And I always remembered that phrase as being so kind of helpful and evocative of something. And I do think that animation, it can be a really powerful tool in that way. I don't really know that I have like brilliant things to say about animation. The reason that Nuts became animated was out of a kind of necessity of what I was trying to accomplish. I knew that when I started the project, I wanted to make a film where there was this charismatic central figure, whose life story I wanted you to become swept up in and turn off your critical faculties, because that's what you do when you're entertained by a good story, and then to kind of like explore how telling a really entertaining story could be a way to like smuggle a kind of con artist, a scam in. So but then I didn't have a charismatic central character because the guy was 100 years dead, and I had a little bit of archival of him, but nothing that was like helping to drive the story forward. So at some point it became clear, at some point being like 2 years into the process, that I reluctantly had to engage in some kind of recreations, because I just couldn't make the film I was trying to make otherwise. And that's pretty indicative of how I think about form. Like, I very rarely am starting a project with a very firm idea formally of what I'm doing. I'm usually starting with a pretty clear idea about like an experience I want the audience to have, or a realization I want the audience to have. And then I'm kind of like looking for whatever tools will let me do that. And that's why my body of work is so diverse, because I'm not interested in mastery. I'm not interested in like mastering the form of animated documentary, or really any form of documentary. I just want to keep like surprising myself and other people and like creating interesting experiences. So the animation for Nuts, I could talk about for 10 hours. It was such a nightmare. I learned a lot in the process. Carol started out knowing more than I did, because I didn't even know it was expensive. So like I kind of like accidentally wrote this script for a movie that had like 55 minutes of animation, and then found out how expensive animation was, which was a big problem. And the big reason why the film took like almost 8 years to make, because it's not a movie that is very fundable, and then I had accidentally kind of painted myself into a corner where I couldn't really raise a lot of money for it, so it was really hard to explain. But it was also, unlike our Nixon, which I actually started 2 years after I started Nuts, but I finished 3 years before I finished Nuts, because our Nixon was easy to explain to people. Like I was able to get that movie funded. And even if I wasn't able to explain it, it was the skills that were required to make our Nixon I personally possessed. So it didn't matter that I didn't have a funded project for most of it. I was at home alone, like doing the work myself. And then with Nuts, I had to hire animators. That is an expensive process. There was no getting around that. And so I had kind of like tricked myself into this bad situation you don't want to be in, which is a film that you need money to make because you need it, not because you want it, but because you need it, and you can't raise money for it because it's too hard to explain. So that's something I've gotten better at. Like, I mean, frankly, Nuts is a great movie, and I'm really glad I made it. But if I were in that situation today, where I had a project that was such a mismatch in terms of my ability to raise funds versus my ability to just do it myself, I just wouldn't do it. Like, that's not the life I live anymore. I'm not going to spend 7 years with unpaid labor, trying to make a movie that no one wants to fund ever again in my life, I hope. Or if I do, it has to be just me. It has to be just me doing it, not like I'm happy to not get paid for my work, but I can't hire people and not pay them. What were you asking, Carol?
Did you work with an animation studio or independent contractors?
It was all independent contractors, and eventually I realized that I was kind of failing on many regards because I didn't know what I was doing. And so I ended up hiring a team of I brought on new producers who were animation experienced people, and they were starting a studio. It's called Cartoona. And so they ended up kind of taking on the producing of the remaining animation. I'd probably gotten like a third of it done before I brought them on, and then they helped me make the rest of it, which was super helpful because I didn't know what I was doing. But it was also this monster task. It was like, again, 55 minutes of animation spread out over 7 chapters, and every chapter had a different animation style assigned to it. So it was a lot. And then I've gotten better at animation now, and my interest in it has dwindled as I've gotten better at it. So that's just, again, another key into like my own work process.
I'm scared now.
No, don't be scared. A short, very doable.
I'm just on the diving board right now. I'm in the development phase, like character design and stuff like that. I'm really scared to jump off the diving board now. Excited, but scared.
Well, maybe we could have a follow-up conversation about it. Like, I definitely learned a few things that were useful. I'll just say one thing in case anyone is interested in animation. One thing that I did badly was that I didn't understand that animation is not just animation. Like, there's all different kinds of animation, right? And there's different sort of goals of animation. There's different skills you need a person to have. And what I needed for my movie was character animation. I needed I needed animators who could create a sense of a character who was like living and breathing and acting, that could be engaging, that you could believe in, that you liked. Like, that was the main thing. And I was very distracted by other things. I was like looking at like, oh, this person works a lot with these like vintage papers, and that looks cool, or whatever. I was distracted by the look of it, and I wasn't thinking about what I actually needed, which was characters. And actually, many animators who are very good at doing like gorgeous motion graphics and have incredible style with like all sorts of things, cool, but not what I actually needed for Nuts. What I needed for Nuts was like character animation. So when I was looking at those reels, all I should have been looking at is like, are these good characters? Like, do they move in a way that's engaging and all that kind of stuff? And that's not always true. That was just the needs of that project in that case. So I hired some people that were the wrong people, and they were great animators. They were just great at things that weren't the things that I needed my movie to be, because I was doing reenactment.
I want to pass it on to a couple of the audience questions that first of all, the ones that we received kind of in advance. So we had an audience question from Jeff DeLeon, who asked, this is a big question. How does one make a living in this industry? I always wondered how nonfiction creators survive in the industry of independent and experimental film.
Carol, what's your plan?
I was going to say, this is a question for Penny. Well, right now I have gigs. I don't really make much off of my films yet, other than sometimes we get like sales, and that's just like a few pocket change, you know. But I have gigs on the side, film gigs, editing gigs, coordination, whatever. But I would love to get to a point where I can do this full time.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try to make this brief. The main answer is that I was a college professor for my whole career until last year. So the whole kind of first part of all the films I made up until 2019 were made as a person who had a full-time job doing something else. And that's obviously a really good job for an artist. There's a lot of flexibility in it. You know, part of what you're expected to do if you're a professor at like a prestigious university, which I was, which is to produce your own scholarship. And so that's like actually part of the job requirement, not something that you have to go do on the weekends or something. So, so it was considered part of my work to make films. In balance with my teaching and in balance with my administrative duties. And so that worked really well for me for a long time. And if you're someone who likes teaching, then that's a great option. And if you're someone who feels like, a little bit more reticent about kind of throwing yourself upon the sort of waves of commercial, demands, which again, as a younger artist, I was extremely insecure. I just don't think I could have withstood. I didn't have the self-confidence, first of all, to think that I could go like make commercials or get paid to make films. I didn't think that was on the table at all for many years, but also I just didn't like the idea. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be like kind of free and be able to make choices that weren't constrained by 100% by economic, decisions. And so that was a good reason to have a teaching job, because I could take whatever risks I wanted with my films. They could take 7 years to make or whatever. And I could have things I could have made films that were giant failures and that wouldn't actually have impacted my ability to eat or pay my rent. I ended up not making films that were giant failures, but I could have. And having that freedom was really important to me. But at a certain point, I started to think like that I really liked making films, and I started to think about the balance of time in my life, and I started to really think that I liked the time I was spending making films more, and that I had built up enough of a reputation to maybe be able to try to make a living as a filmmaker. And so I was very gradual to that idea. And so last year I quit my teaching job, and now I make films for a living. And I think it's going well. I don't know. It's definitely different. You have to have a capacity to balance many more projects at a time. Like at any given moment, there's, actively 6 things I'm working on, and like slightly actively, there's like 12, that I'm at least considering or pitching on or, thinking about and taking meetings about. And there's probably 20 more that I'm like reading about and considering, so it's definitely like a lot more multi-project life. And that is a struggle for me, because I need like long blocks of uninterrupted time to make good art. So the big challenge for me is carving that out while also doing all these other things I have to do, like take all these meetings and pitch these projects and, attach myself to other people. So I'm kind of learning. I'm also learning about how to navigate the world of being like working on a project that's not my own, doing work for hire. That's all relatively new for me over the last few years. And so far, I've really liked it. It's like, a different set of challenges than the ones I had before.
An audience member called Isabella Morris sent in a question for Carol. She says, several of your short films seem very literary, and a few of them are built around voiceover, speaking poetry. So to what extent would you say that your filmmaking process begins with the language?
I would say most of it. I mean, even if it's not written, I consider the way that my characters are speaking and their dialect. I consider that into my writing, and I consider the words that they use into how I portray them and the stories that come after them. I think for me, being Vietnamese Canadian and always having to combine my languages or switch and code switch, I think a lot about language, and I think a lot about how each language, and now learning French, how each language gives us a different perception of the world, especially with the culture that comes with that perspective. So a lot. And I think that blend of language and that kind of cross-cultural identity that I have really informs the filmmaking styles that I make. Even with the symbols that I write in my film, like colors, like in white in Asian cultures means death, but white in Western cultures means hope and marriage. So I would say language and writing makes its way in my films a lot. Even in my documentaries, I script things out. So for me, I'm a person who likes to organize things by seeing it, and so that's kind of the way that I work as well.
When you say you script things out, what does that mean?
That means, even for No Crying, I scripted it out. That means in this scene, this happens. If I have a shot that is fictionalized or a shot that's staged, I know exactly what's going to happen. But for the interview process, I say, okay, in this scene, this character will talk about this. And then cut to this. And then in this scene, this character will talk about this. So that for me, in my head, I know the way that it's edited and the tone and the mood and sometimes even the words that they're going to say. In No Crying, I did pre-interviews before we actually filmed them. So I knew the storyline of what each person was going to say, the emotion that they were going to give. And so I was able to weave that into a script, which obviously changed in editing, but that structure helped me formulate the kind of nonfiction fiction blend that I was going for.
Alex, I'll turn it to you for more of the live audience questions.
Okay, so from Rishi, we have another question for Carol. She says, I also did a very personal film about my family and would love to hear how yours affected your relationship with your family and whether you ever regretted it.
After the film was made, I'm not sure if you've seen the film Regime, but it was a very emotional experience. And after it was done, each of us went back home because we live in different cities, me in Montreal, my sister in Vancouver, my parents in Toronto. And we just kind of had this feeling of, okay, this just happened, but what do we do now? And it took very small baby steps for each of us to pull our own efforts together. But I think the greatest thing that has came out of it was that we have more open communication now. And that me, my mom, and my sister started saying I love you to each other, which we had not said before. So after the end of every phone call, I love you, have a good day. And that is something that is very normal for some people, but for us is very foreign on the tongue, especially if you're raised in a culture that doesn't show love that way. But you go to school and you're taught that on Valentine's Day, you have to write, I love you, and you have to give this person a hug. And on Mother's Day, I love you. So I think putting two and two together was really heartwarming for me. And although it was weird at first, like, I love you, it feels right. And it's nice.
I think that's so great. And I just want to say, there's this kind of it's not an orthodoxy, it's too strong of a word to say it's an orthodoxy, but there's this idea that's like very prevalent in our field where like every act of documentary is somehow exploitative or extractive, and it's very worth it to worry about those things. Like you should absolutely be concerned about those questions. But, you know, in my experience, at least, like this is often a really transformative experience for the subjects. You know, it's incredibly incredible to have, you know, your story told in different ways, or to have someone just pay attention to you in different ways, and to build that kind of relationship that you can build as an artist with your subject can be like absolutely life-changing in like a very positive way. And I do think that that's not talked about a lot in film school. Like I feel like in film school, it's just like, the camera is a gun, be careful who you point it at. And it's like, that's just bullshit. That's not in any way accurate. And if you're like a kind and loving person in your relationships with the world, like you probably don't have much to worry about with your films, because you're probably going to bring that spirit. These are just human relationships like other ones.
So we're running out of time, but I know that there have been several questions about like, just, you guys have mentioned some of the nonfiction films that you are a fan of, but I guess we'll just ask if there are any other favorite creative nonfiction films that I guess that are your favorites or have been really inspiring.
Well, I'll just mention two that I saw this year at Sundance, like back when film festivals were happening and I could go to them. You know, there's two that are coming out sometime this year, so you can keep your eye out for them. One is called Dick Johnson is Dead, and it's Kirsten Johnson's second film. She made a film called Camera Person that I think came out in 2016 that probably a lot of you have heard of. And her second film is speaking of families, and you know, is about her father who's dying, and she makes this film about his impending death and kind of enacting various scenarios in which he dies. And so she kind of hires like a stunt crew, and they do these very realistic creation, I keep saying enactments of his like a piano falling and killing him and whatever. So she kind of ritually kills him over and over again and stages his funeral and whatever. And it's this insanely beautiful, like surprising, you know, it makes you cry, but also it's super funny. And again, speaking of like this idea of like humanity, it's just so humane. Everything about I've thought about it every day since I saw it, and I feel like it like raised the bar in terms of like my own work in a way that's very intimidating. That's one that I really loved. And the second one that's actually a little bit similar was called The Mole Agent, and filmmaker might do something. She's from South America. And The Mole Agent is another film about aging and death, in which a man is hired by a private detective to infiltrate an old folks home and to kind of like find out what the conditions are, like the senior citizens are living under, because they think that maybe their father is being neglected or abused in there, which, as we know, happens in some of these places. And so it starts out with that premise, like this like elderly gentleman kind of goes undercover into this nursing home or retirement community, and it's insanely beautiful and surprising, and that's all I'll say about it. It would give too much away to say. So it was interesting. I saw those films on the same day, two films about like kind of aging and death and that last part of your life that were so profound and so beautiful, and also just again like such exquisitely crafted works of art that I left inspired.
For me, Afterlife, that I mentioned by Hirokazu Kurita, it's also kind of about death. And it's set in this scenario where these characters have just died, and they enter this place where they get to choose one memory in their whole life that is important for them and that they can keep, and they will only remember that one memory, and they recreate that one memory for those characters. And it's really interesting to see the memories that people choose depending on who they are, what stage in their life they died in. And then the other one is called Funeral Parade of Roses by Toshio Matsumoto. It's another Japanese film in the 60s, and it's about the kind of fiction, more fiction than nonfiction, but it's about the life of a transgender dancer in Japan. And then my last one is Stories We Tell by Sarah Polley. That's very lovely. She kind of investigates her father and does investigations into her family to figure out how she got there, who her mother was, and yeah.
So I think we're gonna.
I just wanted to answer a question that's in the Q&A.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. Like, there's a question about like how you, if you are making nonfiction, creative or not, like what kind of rules you might draw, like what kind of lines in the sand you might draw to kind of keep, you know, when I said earlier, like I'm working with these constraints and I like these constraints, like what are the constraints? So one thing that I think is super useful and quite intuitive, and I think a lot of filmmakers do this without even thinking about it, is you sort of, you're engaging in all this manipulation every step of the way. But if you ask yourself, like, if my audience knew that I had made this manipulation, if my audience was somehow able to look over my shoulder every step of the way that I was making this film, you know, would they fundamentally lose trust in me as a truth teller, as a documentary filmmaker? Like, or would they understand that, like, you know, this particular manipulation in context is understandable, permissible, even good for various reasons? You know, so that guides me in the edit room, that guides me every step of the way. You know, when I start to feel like a little iffy about that a particular manipulation in my work, I try to think about it that way. I try to imagine standing up at a Q&A and like announcing that I had done that. Like, you know that in that interview, I actually like did this kind of tricky cut, or like I did swap chronology in these scenes. Like, this didn't happen before this actually happened after. I try to imagine like admitting it publicly in some sense. And, you know, to the extent that that would undermine my credibility, I don't do it. Like, I try not to, you know, do things. Of course, that rule does have limits, because you don't actually know what people are going to object to because they're not in the edit room, but you can at least use a pretty common sense guide to, you know, to like whether you think something is justified. You know, like the example would be like, you know, the very famous Michael Moore film, Roger and Me. The entire film was constructed around him trying to get an interview with the CEO of General Motors, Roger Moore. And, you know, the movie poster is like him pointing a boom pole at this empty office chair. Like, that's the whole movie. But the reality is he did interview Roger Moore and he didn't put it in the film. So, you know, and then he lied about it. So that's also another line. Like, it's one thing to like make a creative decision, you know. So what he said eventually, when actually he never admitted to this, but everyone else in his crew has told everyone else that this happened. But people who were there in the room were like, yeah, we interviewed Roger Moore, it happened. They would say it was a very short interview. He didn't really say anything. And it was as if it didn't happen at all, right? So you might say, creatively, fine. Like, don't put it in the movie, because in effect, he didn't really get to interview him because the interview didn't give you anything. But then to lie about it, I think is actually wrong. Like, there's a line for you. If you're gonna engage in manipulation, you should probably at least tell the truth about it and not spend the next 35 years lying to everyone who asks you about it, like, blatantly. That's just an example. I don't think that Roger and Me loses credibility as a film for that manipulation. I do think the filmmaker loses credibility as a filmmaker from lying about it. And I do think those are two quite distinct things.
Okay, so I think we're going to end our discussion here. We want to make sure people are able to catch up with your films if they haven't seen them. So I believe, Penny, all of your pre-Hail Satan films are now up online for some period of time. Is that?
You know, some quarantine period. I don't know when I'll change it. I put them all up on Vimeo without passwords for some period of time.
Great.
So that's easy to find.
So those are Nix and the Painter Brothers.
Yeah, Nuts and the Painter Brothers. And then Hail Satan is on Hulu if you're in the States, and if you're in Canada, I think it's on Netflix.
Yeah, and it's on Netflix in the UK.
Yes, it's on Netflix in the UK.
Excuse me. And we actually, Penny had come on the Seventh Row podcast last year to talk about Hail Satan. So if you want to hear more about her thoughts on making that, you can listen to that as well. And now Carol, I believe No Crying at the Dinner Table is available in the US on Amazon Prime, but is it available anywhere else?
It's available until May 6th on Amazon Prime, a part of the South by Southwest kind of film festival showcase that they're doing. And then after that, I'm not sure when the next time it will be online. It's kind of uncertain right now with the coronavirus cancellations, but we will see.
Okay.
It's such a crazy time to be releasing a film.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I know Penny and Carol, you're both on Twitter, I think. So if you guys want to, you can follow them and see more about what they're up to. I guess also our initial interview with Penny that we did back at Sundance is in our book on documentary masters, which has interviews with a bunch of other really terrific nonfiction filmmakers like Steve James and Joshua Oppenheimer, and a big section on Frederick Wiseman. So if you're interested in that and in hearing about how different nonfiction filmmakers think about how they make their films and what makes a documentary, you can get that on our website, which is seventh-row.com. So thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll be back next Sunday at 5 p.m. Eastern for a conversation on cinematography.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.